Thank you, Keith. Thank you so much to Fona Foreman and Jerry Mackey for inviting me to be part of this conversation, especially because I think it's important to say that they enable a space to really think of other modalities of research that might not necessarily be scientifically based, but nevertheless very much committed to an idea of translation of cultural patterns, of visual culture, and ultimately an engagement on the ground with collaborations with communities and neighborhoods that really are here, located here in this most contested border zone. So it's important for me to say that because I come from the visual arts department, not only as a visual artist, but also as an architect involved in this discussion as well. I want to begin quickly with the obvious. I mean, all of us know that the explosion of neoliberal development, urban development in the last years of strong economies, also produce in tandem a huge dramatic project of marginalization. I think I'm talking about the explosion also of slums everywhere, surrounding enclaves of mega wealth with rings or sectors of marginality, precariousness, poverty. This urban asymmetry, at the end of the day, I think is at the core of our questions today, in a sense, in enabling a kind of visualization of the crisis, which in fact, in my mind, is not only an environmental crisis or an economic crisis. I would like to forward it primarily as a cultural crisis, a crisis of the institutions themselves, unable to rethink their own protocols, and unable, in fact, to think or to question the stupid ways by which we have grown in the last decades. And I think this, to me, is a very essential and fundamental point to begin with, that at the moment when this oil-hungry, selfish urbanization, of which, in fact, San Diego and Southern California is an epicenter of, it is, in fact, has become unsustainable. I think it's obvious by now that this has been the case, even though we have enabled it by our disengagement sometimes as institutions in questioning the very policies and economics that really endorse this growth in steroids. So I think as these patterns of growth has become unsustainable, and we see that as a problem, we also must understand that the problem is not only that. I think the problem primarily is in the ways by which we think we are solving the problem. And I'm thinking, obviously, of the kinds of camouflaging of this urbanization and steroids by the policies that, while taking us 2 degrees towards a direction that might be more sustainable, nevertheless do not challenge the very policies and economics of growth, as I was mentioning earlier. Or as Mary Robinson mentioned last night very passionately, that the energy gadgets that we must nevertheless produce must connect fundamentally to the socioeconomic protection systems to make them, in fact, operational and sustainable in the long term. I'm talking about, obviously, that the crisis today, when we talk about energy and climate, is also a crisis of institutions that have been incredibly exclusive, perpetuating the disconnection from civic engagement, public participation, and, in fact, the very marginal communities that must be part of the conversation. So we cannot, in fact, separate climate justice from socioeconomic justice. And this is something that, again, Mary reminded us very much last night. In doing so, I'm interested in amplifying the possibility of a public imagination, precisely at a moment when the public itself has become a forbidden word from our political language and our institutions. How do we rethink the public today when the top-down public is not that sustainable? I, as an immigrant in this country, I'm enamored with that image that really emblematized the civil rights movement at some point in this country, when in fact Rosa Parks sat in the seat where she did not belong. We can argue that that seat at that point, that bus was public, but it was not accessible to everyone. So I'm suggesting at times that we must move from our neutrality of our conception of the public, or the neutrality of institutions, separating themselves, obviously, from the civic engagement, and we must re-engage the specificity, in fact, of rights themselves, of accessibility, and in fact, of connectivity of human rights, climate, and urban development. In my mind as an architect, I've been interested, in fact, in embedding my practice into the specificity of the political within this very radical zone of contestation between 2 cities that repel each other, that ignore each other in terms of shaping their own future. So to enter into the political economies of division the actual objects and artifacts that separate our communities and jurisdictions. This is the wall, in fact, that separates Tijuana from San Diego, transforming San Diego into the world's largest gated community. I mean, I'm talking about, obviously, the urbanizations of fear that in the last years have, in fact, divided jurisdictions and communities from governance and from academia, in a sense. Also, obviously, we live in a region, and I think that this is very much, while these patterns of division are replicated everywhere in the world, here they are amplified and dramatized. No other place in the world you will find some of the wealthiest real estate as the one found just barely a few minutes away from here in Rancho Santa Fe, 30 minutes away from some of the poorest settlements in Latin America. This radical proximity of enclaves of wealth and sectors of marginality is obviously dramatized here. I'm interested in the kind of visual process by which I engage the patterns of everyday life in these ecologies and these images of sameness and of difference, trying to understand the social practices of adaptation, of transgression of faulty policies, the rethinking of the political at the very juncture of the top-down and the bottom-up. This is one issue for me that is essential in redefining, obviously, our own ways of constructing city, ultimately our own other ways of constructing citizenship itself. I would love to elaborate on this, but there is no time, about how citizenship really is a creative act that reorganizes institutional protocols at the end of the day. And I think this is what I've been learning from immigrants in their adaptation of environments, obviously in the San Diego region. I've been noticing and documenting transborder informal urbanizations, as there are these flows between these two cities, a flow of people going north in search for dollars, and a flow of trash going south as Tijuana recycles the waste of San Diego. Imagine small post-war bungalow houses from the older subdivisions, the older levee towns in San Diego being transformed and demolished at times, have been given away to Mexican developers. And these are houses waiting to cross the border. Not only people cross the border, but entire pieces of one city move to the next. And these houses, once they cross the border into Tijuana, are put on top of these steel frames, leaving the first floor open-ended for more uses, other programmatic possibilities. I call this a kind of club sandwich of urbanization, this sort of fearless approximation of uses and interactions. Not only houses, but obviously the kind of rubber tires that you've seen for years. Look at what people now are doing in the context of socioeconomic emergency to sustain their own environmental conditions. They have known how to now peel off the tires, thread them and interlock them to construct a more functional retaining wall system in some of those slums, or the garage doors from Riverside or Southern California that are recycled and brought into Tijuana to construct social housing in many of the slums that dot the periphery of the city. I'm talking about, in essence, I've been learning so much, again, from the informal conditions of construction. But embedded in these images is not a glorification of poverty. I'm arguing that behind these images there is a very different understanding of the informal as a praxis embedded in procedures, socioeconomically and political, from which we could learn as institutions. As waste goes southbound, people go north in search, again, of dollars. I'm talking about the positive impact of immigrants in the transformation of the American neighborhood, and in so doing, in helping us to reimagine a very different idea of land use and of density. As many of these immigrants move into San Diego, this is a kind of lyrical splicing of the land use maps of San Diego and Tijuana, because imagine there is no such a thing between these two cities in collaborating and really truly producing a faithful map of these kinds of transactions. So to the north, the large colors of an exclusionary zoning policies that separates bedroom communities from retail corridors and so on, and to the south, the high pixelation of land use from Tijuana that in the last years I've been arguing has begun to infiltrate itself into the largeness of these exclusionary land use policies, altering when it touches the ground, when these alternative land uses touch the ground of many older subdivisions, they begin to alter the homogeneity and the mono-use and monocultural conditions of many of these parcels. I'm talking about the kinds of alternative informal uses, economies and density that immigrants begin to retrofit with the parcels of City Heights, of San Isidro and so on, in the shape of informal, again, economies, the building of an illegal granny flat behind in the artificial house, the plugging of an economy into a garage. This, again, socioeconomic temporal dynamics of alteration of space must be essential to the reimagination of a very different urban policy. From here, the narrativization of stories of these communities, the informal Buddha, I call this a story because it tells a story of a house that did not travel in exile to Tijuana, but stayed in City Heights just to be transformed by a group of Buddhists into a Buddhist temple, and in so doing altering, again, the house into a variety of spaces. I'm interested, in a sense, in the mediating instrumentality, let's say, of these agencies on the ground, whether religious groups, NGOs working in communities that can serve as the translators of many of this stealth activity into new policies and economies, and socio-economic as well, and cultural programming. Obviously, I'm interested in amplifying, in the context of this debate, the fundamental necessity of the interface between institutions and communities from which we might produce a new political language. Rethinking density is essential in our time. For a moment, if I was to ask any of you, how do you conceive of density? What does density mean to the institutions? Probably we will all agree that the way that density has been measured in forever has been as an amount of objects per area that can be quantified. And in fact, in many of these neighborhoods, that equation really does not work. Density is measured instead as an amount of social exchanges per area. Can that be measured by our scientific methodologies or by ways of representing the city not only graphically but politically? And in so doing, I've been amplifying marginal neighborhoods as sites of production, again, mainly when in the last decades the explosion of urbanization was primarily characterized by an urbanization of consumption, as emblematized by Dubai, and to the right, the image of Medellin, Colombia, where the government and civil society and civic philanthropy, in fact, invested in the most marginal zones, seeing them as the focus for rethinking environmental systems and climate and socioeconomic justice, centers of production. The city must go back to an idea of productivity, and in so doing, enabled by new forms of governance, looking at neighborhoods as political units. I am interested in the collaboration with nonprofit organizations on the ground to produce out of these patterns that might be invisible to the institutions, not only UCSD, but at times, obviously, of planning departments and municipalities, making these nonprofits as collaborators to begin rethinking communicational models, to understand urban policy from communities, to in fact challenge the developer's spreadsheet into producing a very different modalities of lending, of breaking apart of subsidy-based, tax credit-based lending into microcredits. In other words, it's difficult to tell this in such a short time, but I've been interested in collaborating with community nonprofit organizations in rethinking political and economic process itself. And of course, obviously, the role of communities in co-producing housing, looking at small parcels in many neighborhoods of San Diego, like City Heights and San Isidro, into socio-economic small systems. I'm going to close with this particular typology that we are developing with Casa Familiar in San Isidro that begins by retrofitting an existing church from 1925 into an incubator of socio-economic and environmental programming into the neighborhood. And in this parcel, then, we add a series of social rooms that are equipped with collective kitchens that become the basis for supporting many of the informal economies and social and organizational practices of this neighborhood, from which then housing typologies begin to emerge. So this one is a building of housing that accommodates single mothers with children that are invited to co-manage some of the programming that is injected into those social rooms in that collective kitchen, a duplex that might house a couple of artists engaging in social practices so that they collaborate with the community and producing pedagogical programs towards environmental and climate justice, as well as large apartments with large kitchens for families who live with grandmothers so that they can also partner with the nonprofit in incentivizing some local economies and so on, including some accessory buildings that are open for extended families and flexible uses. What I'm trying to suggest is that this small parcel is enabled by the coexistence of different models of housing and addressing different demographics and patterns of use. Housing cannot be continued to be seen in isolation of the support systems that are necessary to make it sustainable, pedagogical, cultural, and economic, looking at small parcels as small infrastructures for energy and for social organization. I finished with this, the kinds of small-scale development today as this small parcel that is choreographed by a variety of programming that brings up really the role of these nonprofits as curators that anticipate socioeconomic relations. All I'm trying to suggest, and I'm cutting a huge part of the presentation because I see the time is over, the necessity for a low-carbon growth, or the idea that social, what I call energy loops, the energy of these communities in fact producing a very different set of interfaces with the space that can in fact intensify and problematize the relationship of people, spaces, programs, and resources. I think that must be part of the conversation and rethinking, obviously, energy and climate justice today. Thank you.